This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our supporters at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Future Histories, What Ada Lovelace, Tom Paine, and the Paris Commune Teach Us About Digital Technology by Lizzie O'Shea. When we talk about technology, we always talk about the future, which makes it hard to figure out how to get there. In Future Histories, Lizzie O'Shea argues that we need to stop looking forward and start looking backwards. Weaving together histories of computing and social movements with modern theories of the mind, society, and self, O'Shea constructs a usable past that can help us determine our digital future. What, she asks, can the Paris Commune tell us about earlier experiments in sharing resources, like the internet, in common? Can debates over digital access be guided by Tom Paine's theories of democratic economic redistribution? And how is Elon Musk not a visionary, but a throwback to Victorian-era utopians? In engaging, sparkling prose, O'Shea shows us how very human our understanding of technology is, and what potential exists for struggle, for liberation, for art and poetry in our digital present. Future Histories is for all of us, makers, coders, hacktivists, Facebook users, self-styled Luddites, who find ourselves in a brave new world. Future Histories, What Ada Lovelace, Tom Paine, and the Paris Commune Teach Us About Digital Technology by Lizzie O'Shea, out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and this interview was recorded in Santiago de Chile, but right now, as I read these words, I am back in Providence, Rhode Island. Earlier this year, I posted my interview with Daniel Jadue, the communist mayor of Recoleta, a municipality in Santiago. That interview was in Spanish, and we published a transcript in English at Jacobin. Today's episode is an interview in English with two of Chile's smartest and most interesting left-wing social movement leaders. Alondra Carrillo, an organizer with the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, Chile's powerful feminist coalition that brought hundreds of thousands to the streets this past March, and Pablo Abufom, an organizer with No Más AFP, a mass movement to abolish Chile's privatized joke of a pension system and replace it with something radically better. Both movements pose a challenge not only to Chile's conservative government, led by President Sebastián Piñera, but also to the entire neoliberal order that has followed Pinochet's U.S.-backed fascist dictatorship. But both, I think, also offer leftists everywhere important models for how to build movements that connect workers who earn wages and those who perform unwaged work in the home. And in doing so, work to integrate socialism and feminism into one struggle. These are the sorts of movements, in other words, that can unite a diverse working class. Notably, the current wave of feminist organizing in part grew out of a crisis in Chilean radical left organizations, as women left those organizations over sexism and abuse. Their success since then in building one of Chile's strongest movements is a testament to how important it is for the left to always make feminism core to its politics. I haven't directly witnessed No Más AFP in action, but I did participate in Santiago's Women's March, which drew hundreds of thousands to the streets. It was perhaps the most impressive mass protest I've ever seen in person. It felt as big as the DC Women's March, though I just double-checked that and it wasn't. But given Chile's size, it was much larger per capita. Chile's left is vibrant, And that matters tremendously at a time of right-wing reaction across Latin America. Chile's left is also, surprise, surprise, quite fractious. There are differences between social movement organizers like Carrillo and Abufom, for example, and Jadue's Communist Party, which was, under President Michelle Bachelet, a member of the center-left governing coalition. Another major force on the left is the Frente Amplio, or Broad Front, a collection of various parties with various politics that in part emerged from Chile's vibrant student movement. And so now I've done interviews with a communist leader and with leaders of the extra-parliamentary social movement left. When I return to Chile next year, I promise to do an interview with someone or someones from Frente Amplio. I in no way want to pick sides on the Chilean left. Instead, I want to show those of you outside of Chile its diversity and vibrancy. One quick note. Before the interview, I thought Chile's household debt was one of the highest in the world. I double-checked that, and it's not quite right, but Chile does have the highest level in Latin America. Also, and I'll keep this very short because my book is literally due on Sunday, please support this podcast with money at patreon.com/thedig. Not only do those of you who support this show make the show possible, you have also made my forthcoming book, All American Nativism, on the history of anti-immigrant politics, possible. So far, the book has cost me money rather than made me any. So without the podcast, I would not have been able to work this no-pay second job of writing it. So thank you for your support. And if you do listen to and like this podcast, haven't contributed yet, but can afford to do so, please contribute now at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Oh, and one last thing on the financial front. We are looking for new advertisers. We've got Verso, University of California Press, N+1, and others. If you are a book or magazine or podcast publisher or have some relationship to such things, get in touch with me about advertising. It's a really affordable way to reach a bunch of leftist readers and listeners. Okay, here's Alondra Carrillo and Pablo Abufom. Alondra Carrillo is a psychologist, feminist activist, and member of the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, or the March 8th Feminist Coordinator. Pablo Abufom is a translator, militant in the Solidaridad organization, and a founding member of the Social Center and Projection Library, and also a member of the Coordinadora Nacional de Trabajadores y Trabajadoras No Más AFP, which roughly but not very elegantly translates as the National Workers Coordinator against the Pension Fund Administrator. Alondra Carrillo and Pablo Abufom, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're so happy to be here.
I want to start with a really general question just to set the stage for everything else we're going to discuss. What are Chile's core social movements today, and what does their prominence reflect about the historical trajectory of Chilean politics, society, economics as they've passed in a more long-term context, as they've passed from Allende's popular unity government through the Pinochet dictatorship to this transition that has somehow still not come to an end?
It's hard to answer that because social movements have had a relatively short history of coming and going. So if I should think of the main ones, today it's for one part the feminist movement, of course, that's huge. For another part, the environmental movement that's going on in a sort of fragmented way in terms of hundreds of struggles that are taking place like within like particular conflicts. I believe that those are the living social movements, but we also had a major students' movement in the past decade, and also the movement for pensions. But both of them are like sort of in a pause or are in a moment of decline, are not capable of continuing the process of developing and growing. That's what I would say to open the picture.
There's a narrative in Chile, especially in the left, that we have to understand social movements as spaces of confrontation with the different forms the capitalist state takes in different times. And so basically, this narrative for the left is that we are living under a neoliberal state, and that most of the social movements that exist are confronting that. And when you look to the past and you see social movements before, you see that they are especially in the mid 20th century, 50s, 60s, and 70s, early 70s. They were mostly organized around special, you would say, subjectivities or subjects like the student movement and the labor movement, and also the pobladores, right? The struggle for housing and communities, and also peasants that actually existed in Chile for most of the time. But it's changed now, right? You have mostly agricultural workers more than peasants owning small plots of land or stuff like that. And so you see that social movements in the past are based around that shared experience of being someone or having a special place in society. And so even the left is organized around that. Apart from parties, you have like revolutionary movements that are organized around specific subjects, like everything that the revolutionary left movement did was organized around the Movimiento de Trabajadores Revolucionarios, Movimiento de Campesinos Revolucionarios, so revolutionary fronts for specific subjects. And then after the dictatorship, during the dictatorship and after, you have a sort of like a shift in the center of gravity of social movements towards more complex and we would say multi-sectorial perspectives. So that's why you have a feminist movement, for instance, right now, that it's not exactly only from and for women. It's a lot more than that. It's about coming from the perspective of women and sexual dissidents, building a perspective and developing a perspective about everything that's going on in society, in politics, in the economy and all that.
So what was it about the dictatorship and then the beginning of the transition that changed social movements in Chile from one based around more particular and I guess kind of traditional left subjectivities, like the worker being a revolutionary subject who acts through a union and then a communist party, etc., to, I guess the more pessimistic way to frame it would be fragmented. The more optimistic way to frame it would be transversal or something like that. Does the arrangement of social movements, say, reflect in a negative way the kind of neoliberal order of society? And to what extent are they meeting the challenges of the organization of today's political economy in a necessary way?
I believe what Pablo said to be true. Like there were like political subjectivities that were clearly distinguished and separate from one another, and that framed the way in which the left thought that they had to come up with this new moment to find out that subjectivity that's been hidden or lost or whatever, and that they had the task of encountering it or making it exist in such a way again.
Recovering it.
Yeah, recovering it. And also recover the class because it was lost and nobody remembered that there was class struggle and it was important and shaped the way we lived and etc. I believe that what happened with the dictatorship of Pinochet was that the main spaces in which the class organized itself were, of course, beaten up and destroyed intentionally by politics of the state. and in that way generated a really tense relationship between the organizations of the class and the state. And I think that what's happened in the feminist movement has been different, because we do not think that there's a subjectivity or a political identity that comes before what we have to do. But we believe like it's the other way around. We have to create the conditions of unity. And that means that if our class is fragmented or diverse because it's organized in several conflicts that has no apparent relation with each other, what we had to do was not assume that we have an identity or assume that we have an interest that's shared between all of us, but we had to produce the conditions for that unity to emerge. So what we did, for example, in the last year, preparing the conditions for the struggle, and that's the recovery of historical weapon of the working class, was to try to articulate those differentiated experiences of organizations of the class that actually exists, and putting them in relation and making them discuss the same questions. That was something that was really powerful. No? What's the way in which you live your life in the place that you live in or organize yourself? Why is your life precarizada?
Precaritized.
Precaritized. And who has the responsibility of that to be the way it is? So by doing that exercise, what we tried to do was to set the conditions for a conversation, for dialogue. And from that dialogue to produce a common horizon. And also we didn't we prepared this meeting that was the women in struggle. And we didn't make it a feminist encounter because we knew that feminism had to be something that was a consequence of that encounter and of that shared political activity.
Rather than the premise of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you make an interesting and I think very important argument that feminism, and I think we could also say racial justice and indigenous struggles, we could list a lot of things in this way, are not a divisive or partial sort of politics, but rather a politics that actually helps to unify a working class that is already actually divided. And one way you argue that feminism can do this is by building a bridge between those who are working in formal, so-called productive jobs and those working in the more hidden sphere of social reproduction. Explain your argument here, and from both of you, about the role of feminism in connecting these different areas of working class life.
Last year, with the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, that's the space that I'm part of, we defined what our aims were going to be for the year in terms of building up the process for the struggle in March 8th. And one of those were to transversalize a feminist perspective within the social movement. So what we did was to build an agenda of moments in which we were going to open up discussions precisely around this topic, around the way in which the social movement had been thinking about itself and trying to move the terms of that discussion and that self-conscious of the movement. So we organized in the first part of the year the first women's and pensions encounter. That was a meeting in which we discussed the pension system that we have today. That's the AFP,
which means administrator of pension funds, more like.
Yeah, we did that with coordination with the Coordinadora No Más AFP. That's the space in which the working class organizes itself to end that system. And in discussing the pension system, we proposed that a new pension system had to be funded in a principle that was the main aim of a pension system has to be to ensure the reproduction of the life of people that perform the works that sustain life itself. With that knowledge, with that point of view, what we did, in fact, was to connect those sorts of differentiated works, like the productive work and the social reproductive work, and say they're all the same in one level. Of course, they're different, but they're all the same in the level that they sustain life, day-to-day life. And in that sense, women that perform work at home or not at home, maybe in the streets or whatever, are performing works that sustain life and as such are part of the working class itself. So the notion of the working class has to change. And I believe that's what feminist movement has practically proposed.
That common sense in the left in Chile is that it's like everything in Chile before the dictatorship was amazing, and then dictatorship came and we were completely fucked. And so social movements changed and we lost every social right and human right that we used to have. And that's simply not true. I mean, Chile was a capitalist country before the dictatorship too. It's not that capitalism began, or oppression in general began in Chile with the dictatorship. Maybe except from amazing and exhilarating, but also tragical days of the Popular Unity government. Most of the time in Chile, since it's the beginnings of the republic, has been a country of dispossession and destruction of everything, and on the part of the workers and the peasants and the oppressed groups. So I think that's one of the narratives that has to be challenged in Chile, because we tend to think of recovering what's lost as if there's a lost paradise lost somewhere. And so I think one of the consequences of that narrative is that the left doesn't see the changes in the working class, because it tends to understand that politics is about the confrontation between political projects such as neoliberalism versus democracy, for instance. As if what we have is basically a confrontation between two political wills or political projects in a vacuum, and so they're just like fighting and confronting different projects. And it's not that the dictatorship changed. I mean, a lot of things, especially for the working class composition, is it happened during the dictatorship. Is a global process that was already happening,
and perhaps took an extreme form in Chile, but not a unique form.
Exactly. And so that means that you have a new working class, and that for me explains the behavior of the social movements and actually the fact that the labor movement and that the working class is politically organized, not only and less in political parties and more in social movements. Because if you don't have a strong labor movement, if you don't have a lot of unions, I mean, the union affiliation rates in Chile are around 10% and 11%. If you don't take the public sector, which is obviously mostly unionized, right? When you don't have a strong union movement, the working class has to find new avenues for organization, right? And then social movements come as a space for politicization and opening a space for struggle that it's not the political parties or the unions. It's not that they don't exist; they actually exist, and we've seen in the past years like a rebirth of politics in a way, with Frente Amplio offering a space for that kind of political struggle and tactics. What I believe is that what the left is lacking sometimes in Chile is understanding this new composition of the working class as at the same time a single class with multiple experiences and differences, and not only differences but also inequalities within itself. So I would say you have like three sectors in the left. One, the old, more orthodox, you would say anti-capitalist or revolutionary left, which is marginal right now, more sectarian, that is basically saying there's no changes in the working class. The working class is the same as before, and so they are Like they are resistant to feminism, for instance. They think that that's divisive.
And an example of this sort of force in Chile would be?
There's the Central Clasista de Trabajadores. They produced an analysis of the March 8th struggle, and they said that a strike is a fight between the employer and the workers. Women can organize for their own specific problems and matters.
But it's not a strike.
And for that, they have to create a department or whatever to organize themselves. So they have one, and they have the space for them to come up with these visions on the particularity of being a woman. But that's not a strike.
And is this a Trotskyist group, or?
No, it's not. No, it's radical left.
Different strands of whatever was left from the 80s and 90s of the left in Chile, which is basically marginal, but it used to have a strong presence in some sectors of the student movement. And also, I mean, there's always like sects everywhere in the left,
yes.
Right? But then, so you have the concept of an old class. The working class is the same as before, and so we have to keep organizing as students and workers. That means unions, and then pobladores or the communities, right?
By these like old kind of sectoral model.
And maybe also women.
Yeah, and women as a new sector, and then sometimes the youth and even the indigenous people. So you start like adding different sectors. Then you have the extreme opposite, which is the left, the renovated left, that now says there's no working class. The working class was completely, not even like transformed, it was eliminated by the dictatorship, by the social and economic transformations. And then we only have middle class, different sectors, the extreme poor. And so you only have like a socioeconomic strata that you have to like address them with public policies.
And would this be like the Socialist Party, or?
That would be the Concertación, like definitely, and even some sectors of the Frente Amplio that subscribe to more like the Negrian multitude idea of a working class, that it doesn't have a shared, as Alondra was saying, that it doesn't have like a shared historical material interest, right? And so you have like a denial of the existence of working class. And that means that you don't have an actual historical project to base the political alternative on. And I think that's
because there's no more historical subject.
Exactly. So there's only like this political vacuum where like you have basically advertising communication specialists trying to build a people, right? To like construct this idea of a people around whatever like conjuncture you have every time. I think that there's this middle like ground, like there's a space in between those extremes. That is this idea of there is a working class, but it has a lot of differences inside, and that means you have to take those into account if you want to build working class unity, and if you want to build stronger social movements with a shared perspective, a shared program, and a shared struggle. You need to take those differences into account and not just see them as divisive identities or whatever reactionary idea of the difference within the working class.
Yeah, because it's not feminism that created that gendered the current capitalist order. It's capitalism that did that. We should step back a little bit before we get too much deeper into this and just explain for listeners that Chile has one of Latin America's strongest feminist movements, really probably one of the strongest in the entire world. Alondra, can you explain the scope and nature of the movement here and why you think it is that it has become so powerful in Chile of all places?
Well, the feminist movement in Chile has a long history. The first organized expressions of feminism were in the early 20th century with a feminist movement, or sort of, in the Pampa Salitrera. No idea how to say that in English. But
the saltrites, the mines? which was the major boom industry in Chile in the very early 20th century.
Yeah.
Late 19th and
Late
early
19th, yeah, before they figured out how to synthesize it, and then
yeah.
not so great for Chile.
And then we turn to copper.
And everything will happen again.
Yeah.
We don't learn. Yeah. There were the first organized feminists, working class feminists, anarchists, anti-clerical. So that's the first moment of the feminist movement in Chile. Then in 1935 there was the MEMCH, Movimiento Pro Emancipación de la Mujer Chilena, a movement that organized itself for many things. One of them was political emancipation, the vote, but also abortion, also economic emancipation. Also, I don't remember the whole program, but it was like really complex and involved several elements of women's life in those days, and that movement was huge. It organized women all throughout the country and in the cities and in the country, and it was really powerful. And in 1948 it gained the women's right to vote, and then it declined.
Very late.
Very late.
Yep, everything in Chile is like that.
Yeah.
We got the divorce law like in 2005. There you go.
Yeah.
So you all have your work cut out for you in the feminist movement here.
It's been a really long struggle. Women who were the main organizers of that weren't able to vote, because when they gained women's right to vote, there was this radical Frente Popular, and it came out with the Ley Maldita and prohibited the vote for women and men that were part of the Partido Comunista. So they weren't allowed to vote.
So the very communist women who led the struggle for women's suffrage lost the right to vote alongside communist men.
Yeah. It's really interesting because it's it's really long to explain, but the MEMCH was part of the Frente Popular.
Popular Front.
Popular Front, yeah, Judeans Popular Front. And then in the 80s, in the dictatorship, women led the resistance towards the repression and organized the second MEMCH, MEMCH 83, because of the year it was founded. And in the beginning of the eternal transition, there was also a feminist movement that was quite well organized, but was absorbed by the politics of the state. It was institutionalized and divided and broken, really. So we have a long history of women's organizing and debating and creating their own political institutions, so to speak. So we have that memory. We may not have it explicitly. We don't know that history, but I believe that we have bodily memory of that, a subconscious memory of that processes of organization. That's part of the culture of political culture here. So in 2016, women in Argentina organized the Ni Una Menos.
Not one less?
Yes, yeah. You should know it's the biggest feminist movement in the world, I believe. Yeah, the biggest one. And we in Chile had been the last few years organizing in feminist collectives and little organizations and etc. And that call from the women in Argentina was heard here and had a quick response, a massive response in the streets. And that was the first march of the Ni Una Menos movement here. And a few years after that, 2018, we organized the National Day of Protest in the March 8th. And that was also really, really big. And what was happening was that women that were part of political leftist organizations and so on had been living those places and organizing autonomously, and also making feminism the first source of political activity in their lives. So that happened to a lot of us, like in a simultaneous social process, I believe.
That brings up two different things that I want to talk about. Before we get to the exodus of feminists from traditional left organizations, I want to ask about why it was that femicides, the murder of women, became the initial issue that feminists were mobilizing around in Chile. You write, Alondra, that femicides are the most brutal expression of a more expansive structural violence. Can you say a little bit about why it is that femicides were the thing?
I think it's not transparent. It's not self-evident. Why? I believe it's a question, an open question. So I have an hypothesis. That's mine. But what I believe is that the femicide has been, like, for decades a problem in Latin America, of course. But what happened is that the heterosexual relations in our country and also in Latin America had been going through this crisis because of the progressive autonomy of women in conditions of precarity and poverty and whatever.
So it was this contradiction between women's social emancipation being accompanied by general impoverishment and precaritization for everyone, women and men alike, across the board.
Yes, that's what I believe, and that's that produced a collapse of the terms of the relations, and that happens in the relation, like in the private relation between men and women that sustain heterosexual relations and stable and so on, but also a more general process of crisis of all the institutions in which that heterosexual relation reproduces itself. So education, the streets, the public space in general. And everywhere that crisis began to spread and like to mobilize women in a sort of alliance, political alliance that was funded by both a limit and a potentiality. The limit was to say no, to stop the violence that was a constitutive part of the reproduction of the heterosexual relation, and also the potentiality of encountering one another and developing a politics of their own, a feminist politic. So that's why I believe femicides became the core of feminism, because it's the most radical moment of that crisis.
Yeah, I agree with Alondra, and also I would add maybe a more superficial layer. It's that there's been a permanent campaign against femicides organized by the Chilean Network Against Violence Towards Women that's been around for maybe 10, 15 years. And I think it has had some impact in society. It definitely has had some impact in the social movements and the left, even in some sectors of the establishment political parties. Because some, as Alondra was saying, some of the women who struggled against the dictatorship organized in the autonomous feminist movement in the 80s then became officials in the government, in the Concertación government the administrations of the 90s, working in the National Women's Service and all, and maybe some NGOs and in other places. So there's a continuity despite the tremendous difference. There's some continuous thread between that struggle, the autonomous struggle in the 80s, the more institutionalized and NGO struggle or movements of the 90s, and then a new feminism in Chile that, from my perspective, it has accomplished something that the left has not accomplished in decades, like after the dictatorship. And that's basically being able to express the diversity of social movements, of the people of the working class, I would say, in a single sentence. Like when you see that during the past year, there was a huge mobilization of forces from the feminist movement that actually mobilized more than just women. And it also made a lot of men very uncomfortable with the process. And so we were forced to do and say and act and learn about not just feminism, but our own reality. When you see that there are thousands of women preparing a strike for March 8th this year, and then hundreds of thousands in the streets, and that they were marching not just against violence against women, not just against femicides and abuse and all that, which are definitely at the center of the demands of the movement, but they were also marching and rallying around issues like the pension system and issues like the destruction of the environment, because it's completely connected with the murder of leaders in the South, indigenous leaders defending their communities and their ways of life. And so my impression is that the feminist movement has been so strong in Chile in the past 2 years because it has taken to itself to do that the left hasn't been able to do. That is, work for unity in a practical and actual way.
How is it that a movement that is initially centered around an extremely important, but in some ways very minimal demand, stop killing us, connects so organically to far more maximalist demands about total transformation of society and economy? In that way, it seems somewhat similar to Black Lives Matter, which is premised around what should be a very basic and undebatable demand to stop killing us, but then has this much broader vision. How do those levels of demands connect within the movement?
I believe what we have done, it's when I say we, I mean all the sectors that has been organizing to discuss the terms in which the feminist movement in Chile is organized. What we had to do was to fight, because the relation between that minimum demand of not killing us and the possibility of creating more general perspectives was not given. It was not something that was agreed by everybody in the feminist movement. Some people in the feminist movement said and argued that what we had to do was to focus on that, on extreme violence against women. And what some other sectors of the movement said, but when you organize women and we articulate with each other, what happens necessarily is that the problems and the struggles of day-to-day life become the concerns that we have to take care of, to take upon. And because what we had been doing was to articulate different expressions of organized women, not just women that organize themselves around violence, but also women that organize themselves around other things, but that were also organizing around violence. And when we did that, those women started to say, yeah, of course it's against violence, but I also don't have a place to live, and that's violence. And also I have to protect my territory, my land, the seeds with which I feed my family and whatever. And also I have to to fight for working conditions that don't threaten me with losing everything I have every day if I don't behave correctly and whatever in work. So it was kind of a process that occurred naturally when we created new conditions for the feminist movement to organize itself. I believe it was a consequence of the aim that we had to articulate different expressions of organized women. And not just organized women that came along and like lit a candle for this femicide or that femicide, or went to the streets, but because we organized a movement that was like more solid and had a perspective and had a commonality that was built and not given.
I just wanted to there was a moment right before the strike, the March 8 strike this year, that the government, they started to, like, the president and also the women's ministry, she would say, and the president, other people in the government, they would say, this movement, the March 8 strike, it looks like a politicized thing. It's very ideological, and they are not focusing on the women's issues, right? Because they are talking about pensions, and they are talking about housing and environment and the economy. These are not women's issues. This is what they were saying, right?
Which is ironic to hear from a conservative government, because they wouldn't even accept women's issues on narrow liberal terms of like abortion and things.
Exactly. But when that Ministry of Women and Gender Equality for this conservative government, just like she was appointed, her program, her proposals were basically like the minimum. I would say the minimal program of any liberal feminism. So basically, like breaking the glass ceiling and like more women in the corporate government. And so for them, it's basically like formal equality in those terms, right? And so all of these other issues were not women's issues. That's one thing that I wanted to say. But also, there's a comrade from the feminist movement. She's a survivor from the dictatorship, and she's part of an organization of survivors. And she always says that this feminist movement and any feminist movement should be like a memory of the future, in the sense that the struggle of those comrades who were tortured and killed and disappeared during the dictatorship should not just be commemorated and remembered as tortured people and disappeared people, but also as social fighters and people who struggled for something. And so repositioning socialism, for instance, as a horizon of those struggles in the dictatorship, and not just mere resistance against the dictatorship, stop killing us, right? That repositioning socialism or a revolutionary horizon is a way to reconnect the struggles of today in a different way. And I think that's another reason why the feminist movement has had such a strong, I would say, like, it has been rooted in the contemporary social movements, because it's thinking about that horizon and not just understanding women as a fixed identity, but understanding them and themselves as complex individuals and groups. And I would say you could see, I could see like a parallel. I'm just like making this up, but it's like a trade union feminism versus class feminism, right? Like there's like class struggle feminism, in the sense that it's trying to think and organize around global issues in a political perspective, and not just like individual and things that appeal to your immediate individual experiences.
There's a few things that you touched on there that I want to talk about. One, that you seem to be, if I read you right, hinting at something, which is that the dictatorship's brutal repression of the left here can often get sort of sanitized within a human rights framework. Is that fair to say, where the actual politics that were defeated by the dictatorship are sort of erased in favor of just seeing people as generic humans who were
exactly victims? And this is the result of having the people who organize the transition from the dictatorship to a political transition from the dictatorship to democratic government, so to speak. It's the same people who were like governing the country for the next 20 years after 1990. And so the official memory of the dictatorship has to be sanitized because they are responsible for completely, I would say, like debasing and removing any sort of revolutionary edge to the struggle against the dictatorship. It was basically against the dictator.
And not for socialism
Not for anything else.
or all the other things that people are fighting for.
I agree 100% with Pablo, but also thinking of the same compañera, of the same woman that is part of this organization of survivors of the dictatorship, the sanitization of the violence that was used against organized people was also neutralization of the gender component of that violence. And so the sexual violence that was specifically directed towards the women that were organizing and that had a political specific component was also erased from the table and was not discussed. And when we discuss it, and we discuss the patriarchal dimension of that violence, we can associate that dimension of patriarchal violence with the need for patriarchal violence in general within the system that we live in today.
Yeah, that's a very important point. You wrote something that I want to talk about now because it relates to this whole issue of sort of why the Chilean feminist movement is something way beyond or even really opposed to liberal feminism. You write that the Chilean feminist movement is after a lot more than merely fighting for gender equality because, quote, when we look at our lives, there is no masculinity that serves as a model to which we might aspire. It's everyone's lives that are subjected to precaritization. This isn't really, I think, powerful but complicated argument. What are you saying here about the relationship between the economic system and the construction of gender roles and about the way that a sort of simplistic gender egalitarianism reaffirms rather than really challenges capitalism?
Well, I was discussing not with liberal feminism, but with men in political leftist organizations, because they tend to believe that what we want is equality.
Interesting.
And we don't want equality because maybe we want in some level, but in general, no, because the way that gender relations are organized today in Chile are constitutive of how we organize life. And if we want to challenge how we organize life, we of course do not want to be in the same position that our companions are, because that position is not neutral. It's not like a desirable position. It's a position that is produced by the same relation in which we are currently living. And so what we're saying when we say that, and we have said that in several moments, is that ours is a universalistic perspective. And so
it's for everyone's liberation.
For everyone's liberation, and that means that even within the political organizations of the left, we do not want to igualar la cancha. That's the way.
Level the playing field.
Yeah, level the playing field, because the playing field is all wrong, and because we do not want to be in a subordinated position and simply question that subordination. We want to question why that subordination is organized in that way, and why should we even have subordinated positions within the working class itself.
We touched on this a little earlier, but you, Alondra, mentioned this mass exodus of women and feminists from left organizations in recent years. And you write that it's no coincidence that emerged in the wake of this exodus. What happened in terms of feminists within these longer-standing left organizations?
Violence happened, I believe. Well, feminism had been struggling and fighting within the political organizations of the left for decades. But recently, what happened was that we had this ongoing process of recognizing each other and talking about our experiences and talking about violence and talking about how we've been abused and harassed in our lives, etc. And we found out that we had been abused or harassed or whatever in the organizations that we were in on behalf of our, our compañeros, our...
Like male comrades.
Yeah. So what that produced was, of course, anger and indignation and demand that was targeted to our organizations to solve that, and to solve that in whichever way that could be possible. And like most political organizations did nothing, or were really slow, or were like erratic, or made several mistakes in regarding this situation and those allegations. So women got tired of waiting and they left, but they were militants, so they were not going to go back to their houses and like forget about politics. They were going to organize themselves again. And that's sort of what happened. So the same thing that had been the ongoing process that led to women going to the streets was the process that ended up with several left organizations broken up or disappeared or whatever. Yeah, our organization was really big before the...
You both were in the same organization?
Yeah. And our organization was like large and is now really little, and was one of the little ones that survived to this, but with high costs, of course.
I want to talk about the pension struggle here. What is No Más AFP, in English, no More Pension Fund Administration? What is the current social security and pension system here? And what is the movement's popular law initiative, which aims to transform the whole system as it currently exists?
So there are no pensions in Chile. That's the.
So what are they administering?
Yeah. Well, they call it a pension, but it's not exactly a pension. I mean, that's one thing that the dictatorship actually destroyed in Chile is the pension system. There used to be a social security pension system, but it was destroyed during the dictatorship. We're used to say that it was privatized, but it's not really the same pension.
It's not like it exists in private form. It was
destroyed, and what they built on it and using the same money basically from the workers is private institutions that would channel the money from the workers every month to the private corporations through complex finance systems. So it's basically using that money to fund the private enterprises in Chile, just like that. So it was a huge impulse for the economic, as they call it, the miracle in the 80s in Chile, because they had like access to massive funds at a time where they wouldn't have a lot of funds available.
They basically created all this liquidity by expropriating this money from the working class and putting it into private investment.
Exactly. And so
Wow.
For that system, the pensions are a collateral damage. I mean, they have to save face and pay pensions every month to the workers who are not working anymore, but it's not their business is not pensions, right? And so, and that's one thing in a global terms. But then the system also changed in terms that it's not a pension system; it's a private individual's insurance system. So you basically make a monthly contribution to your own individual account, and then when you retire, they make some weird calculation that you're gonna die when you're 120, and so they divide that money in monthly installments, and you get if you're lucky, 30% of what you were getting in your regular wage the past 5 or 10 years. So it's basically a massive process of permanent expropriation of we would say surplus value from the working class in Chile. So in that context, what you have is that when you have a so-called pension system that is based on a private insurance, individual insurance system that is based on whatever you take out of wages plus profitability in the finance industry, then you have the recipe for disaster, right? It's the perfect crisis in the pension system for retired workers because the wages keep going down as well as profitability. And so basically we are in, since the crisis in 2008, we are in a deep pension crisis in Chile that was so strong that the government in around those years had to create a new, what they call the solidarity pillar, that is basically a public funds to poor people who haven't been able to contribute to their own individual accounts, or that their wage is not enough to pay good pensions. And so basically the state is subsidizing what the private pension companies should be paying. So we have and that seems like a progressive move, right? But it's basically
it's subsidizing the private system.
Exactly. And so that prompted that a lot of unions, mostly in the public sector or in more established sectors and industries like the banks, the workers from banks and financial institutions, but also public workers, started organizing around this pension crisis, especially since the recession in 2008 and how a lot of pension funds were lost because of decline in profitability, right? And so in 2014, we see the emergence of the Coordinadora Nacional de Trabajadores No Más AFP, the National Coordination of Workers No Más AFP, No More AFP, the pension funds administrators. It was a small movement for a couple of years, although it started to coordinate several big unions, mostly public sector unions, which are not exactly unions, are like associations of workers, but they are the symbol of unions in the public sectors.
And they're more powerful than the private sector here, in part because the private sector unions, as insofar as I've heard, are incredibly fragmented. Like you'll have one shop, which because of Chilean labor law, which ideally would be represented by one union, you'll have like 10 different unions.
You're supposed to have one union per shop or a company, but you can have more. And so that it's not just, I mean, in the States, you would have one union for several companies in the same sector, right? But then in Chile, you would have only just one union per company in general.
And that's the best case scenario.
Exactly. Because you can have several unions in one same shop.
But also companies can be internally fragmented and so have like different personalities in terms of their relation with the state. And so for each one of them, they have a union.
And they'll have contracts with each of the different union locals or whatever. And
not to mention subcontracting practices and outsourcing and all that, because you have different unions for all of them. And then if you don't have enough workers, like 25 or 30 workers, you can't have a union. So it's pretty shitty for the labor movement in Chile. And so and that's one of the reasons, as we were discussing before, why workers sometimes start organizing around other class issues, not from the unions or not like in the context of unions. And so this No Más AFP movement began to gain some traction, especially in 2016, after there was a scandal, like more like a media scandal of one of a former public worker, like an official from one of a high rank official of the prison. It's one of the like forces, police forces for the jails. So she was a high rank official, and she was getting a retirement that was like, I don't know, like 100 times what a regular worker would get. But also she used to be married to one socialist politician. So it was like a perfect storm for this pension crisis, right? I mean, for the media, it was a huge scandal. A lot of people were outraged by this, and this prompted huge movement. Sort of like they actually adopted the term indignados, like in Spain, and they called for a march, and it was like autonomously like an autonomous call in social media. But then the Coordinadora No Más AFP also joined this call for a march, and it was huge. Like before March 8th this year, it was the biggest march like before, like after the dictatorship.
And so there was this pre-existing organization to get rid of the AFP and replace it with a real pension system, but it was small. But then the historical circumstances changed, and the sort of popular energy came right to you.
Exactly. And what happened was that more unions, especially public sectors and big national unions, joined the movement. But also there was an impulse from the grassroots organizations that started organizing in their own like territory, in their own communities. They started organizing locals of the Coordinadora, right? So it became a stronger national movement with local presence. And that's interesting because you have the same working class organizing in unions when they can, and then organizing in different social movements, sort of like politicized experiments on the ground to fight for the same cause, but like organized differently. Because you have everybody in the movement is a worker. The only ones who are interested in the pensions are workers, right? And so you have workers who are not part of unions because they are precarized workers in the informal sector, like women who work at home but don't have a wage, and they are organizing, or retired people that are organizing in this grassroots like section of the movement.
Well, and this is also an issue that connects very easily to the feminist struggle in the sense that it connects productive workers who are recognized as workers under capitalism and workers whose work is hidden from view under capitalism, reproductive workers, people working in the home, care workers. What is the relationship between the feminist and the pension movement looked like?
It's hard to say what's the relation between the movements, because maybe the most organized sectors of the movement, we have been trying to work together to like open these spaces like the meeting of women's and pensions, and then in our program for the strike, the issue of pensions was one of the main demands of the strike. But the movements themselves are not really connected. They're not that connected because I believe it's been hard for these coordinadoras that Pablo was describing to actually be transformed by this powerful energy of the popular movement. That has not happened in that way. And I believe that those difficulties, that are difficulties between bureaucratic orientations or some orientations that do not take into account that energy as a source of the ongoing process of organizing itself, has also been an obstacle in making a productive relation between these two movements.
And is that because of obstacles in the leadership of both movements?
I'm not quite sure. Tomorrow we will have a meeting with the Coordinadora Feminista 8M. That's one of the spaces that organized the strike of March 8th, the No Más AFP Coordinadora, and also other spaces like organizations that revolve around housing and stuff, to think how we can connect our struggles. It's hard because we understand differently, I believe, the potentialities of our movements, especially the potentialities of the feminist movement, of course. Mm-hmm. That's what I believe.
I think there is a potential connection in terms of they are both movements that point to the similar crisis, right? Which is a I would say, crisis in social reproduction. Pensions are basically the way workers reproduce themselves generationally after they stop working, and the way that the working class in general reproduces itself, like in those moments that it's not working. So, and that's definitely, I mean, that is in itself a feminist concern, right? And so I think that there's still some sectors of the leadership of No Más FP, there's a resistance to this feminist idea that the struggle for pensions is not an merely economic struggle. It's not about like a different moment of your waged life, but it's about a general moment of reproduction. And I think that's where the connection is between the feminist movement and the whatever like social movement around pensions.
Is it also fair to say that within the feminist movement, there's a kind of inverse resistance to seeing a quote unquote economic issue like pensions as a women's issue, as a feminist issue?
Yes. Yeah. I believe some women that were part of March 8th, March and stuff, didn't understand why pensions was one of the demands of the struggle. But I believe it's a few women. It's not really like a huge resistance, because I believe today the feminist movement and its core concerns are really open. I don't think that it's really established what is a feminist concern or a women's concern. I don't think it's set in stone. So it's open for discussion, debate, and participation of women from different places. But I do believe that some sectors of the feminist movement tend to see those concerns as unionists. Some sectors have pointed out that our feminism, the feminism that is concerned with work and work conditions and pensions and stuff.
Marxist feminism.
Socialist feminism is like unions feminism. And they also see this as an economic problem, and they also have reductionist notion of the capitalist way of organizing our lives.
It's interesting because socialist feminists sort of have to confront reductionism on two fronts, on the gender and economic front.
Yeah, every time.
Pablo, I wanted to talk more about No Más, No More AFP, in English, No More Pension Fund Administration. Who makes up the leadership of the Coordinadora? Who is your base, and how do you organize them?
The Coordinadora was founded 5 years ago. Yeah, the Coordinadora was founded in 2014, after several years of trying to organize around the crisis of the pension system in Chile. It was founded by a series of big unions. And when I say big unions, it's because in Chile we have hundreds of thousands of unions, because the unions are reduced to, they can only negotiate with their company, their single company. But in the case of some public sector unions, you have large organizations that have more than half of the workers in a specific sector, in public hospitals, in other sectors of the public service.
Because in many workplaces in Chile, because of Chilean labor law, there might be multiple unions representing multiple fractions of workers across a single workplace, which is obviously not very good for labor's
crazy
power.
Yeah, yeah. That's part of the dictatorship work, right? They did that. They changed the way unions could be organized, and basically what they did was to reduce the scope of the union to a single workplace. That's one thing. So there's no legal collective bargaining on an industry level. You can't do that legally. There are workers, like the port workers in Chile, that have been able to organize de facto unions on a national level that has negotiated with the state, both the state and the companies in the port sector, right? those are like only a few examples of that. Most of the workers are not organized in unions, and the ones that are, their unions are very weak. So the Coordinadora was founded by unions in places, in industries that were more organized, and the public sectors, like the bank workers and people working in public hospitals. And a couple years ago, the teachers, the National Teachers Association, joined the Coordinadora. So the main leadership of the Coordinadora is made of representatives of those unions. But also, as we were saying before, the movement had a peak around 2016, 3 years ago, when we had big demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, maybe around 1 million in the country. And at that time, the movement needed a new way to organize itself, and not just with national representatives of the unions, but also organizing locally. And so the Coordinadora started to creating what we call comunales, which are basically city-wide or local, or you would say on a municipality level, chapters of the Coordinadora. And that was created also by people from those unions, but also local activists who are already organizing around pensions or other social causes, other struggles in those places. And so the Coordinadora became, at some point, a place that local coordinadoras, those comunales, those spaces on a local level, they became a space for organizing around pensions. But since the demand for a new pension system is so broad, it's a demand that is so broad that it calls for a lot of people to organize around that. Mm-hmm. So it's not just people who are in unions, because a lot of people are not in unions.
But there's still workers who have an interest in the horrific state of pensions in Chile today.
Yeah, people who are retired even are part of the Coordinadora. They take part in the struggle too. So that means that the base for this struggle is not just the labor movement in the traditional sense, it's the workers in a more broad sense. It's whoever is dependent on work and wage, or who is dependent on someone who is dependent on work and wage to live, that is involved in this movement. So that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point you just made, because I think it's very revealing, Alondra, that the feminist movement gravitated towards the pension issue early on. Are pensions an issue like education and healthcare that can tie the feminist movement to other working class struggles by connecting the fights between productive and social reproductive workers?
One of the reasons why we moved towards the pensions issue was because the way in which the pensions movement, No Más AFP, was organized kept outside of the scope the issue of reproductive labor and the way that labor sustained life itself. So in order to broaden the demands of No Más AFP and to take into account that labor, we created this meeting of women's and pensions, and also took that demand as part of the program for the strike. I believe that's because of the relation between not only productive and social reproduction spheres or aspects of life, but also because of the need to engage women in some of the discussions that had been really moving for the social movement itself. So we could connect those fights and also help the force or the power of the feminist movement and the women's movement to encourage and dynamize the pensions movement that was declining.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, and by, well, good question, who? You frequently hear ads right here from Verso, University of California Press, and N+1. We are now looking for new publishers to advertise with us. Do you write or work for a magazine or book publisher? If you do, can you think of any group of people more interested in buying smart left-wing books and magazines than Dig listeners? Because, well, I sure can't. If you want to advertise your media product on The Dig, email me at firstname@gmail.com. That's danieldenver@gmail.com. That is also, incidentally, where you may send me listener letters, which, as long as they are not intensely mean, I always do my best to respond to. Okay, thank you, and back to the show. To what degree have both of you found, I guess, obstacles in two different directions? On the one hand, have you encountered people in the labor movement who don't see social reproduction work that's currently unwaged as actual work, and thus have trouble making those connections? And on the other end, have you encountered feminist activists who say pensions, that's a labor issue, not a women's issue. We should just be focusing on issues like abortion and violence and issues that are narrowly, conventionally understood as women's issues, feminist issues?
Yeah, I would say some people in the labor movement, it's not that they don't see unwaged work as non-actual work, it's that they don't see that work. They just simply don't see it. It's like it's not there, right? It's an invisible activity. And that means, and I'm saying this because they don't see that most of the people involved in the movement and most of the leaders on a local level are women. Because women are involved are concerned, directly concerned, and maybe doubly concerned by the problem of pensions, right? If someone who they are in charge of, or who they have to take care of in their house or in their community, has a miserable pension, they have to work more in order to take care of that person, in order to buy medicine, in order to sustain them, right? So it's an immediate issue for them. And they have been on the front of that struggle. But as in the labor movement in general, the leadership is mostly men and older men. And it's a fact. It's the way it is right now. And some of those leaders have been instrumental in building a strong movement. But you can see the contradictions now. Not just because they are old men, but because since they are old men, they don't see the necessity of feminism right now. They tend to, because they don't see it, they don't see that work, and because they don't see those leaders on a local level being mostly women, they don't see the necessity of feminism for their movement. They see it as it's very important, they say. Right now, there are no changes without the feminist movement. They say that, but it's like external from them. It's another thing. It's not their stuff.
So it's not so much that there are conservative currents within the labor movement that would have a problem around, say, demands for abortion.
No, there are.
Oh, there are also.
No, there are. Yeah, there are leaders, men and women, who opposed talking about abortion in their unions because that would alienate some of their bases. So they're basically thinking in electoral terms within the union, right? It's like they don't want to lose their voters for the next election. So they don't want to talk about hard issues, basically.
Yeah. And one of the ways in which resistance towards broadening the scope of the feminist movement appears, it's an expression of a wider tendency towards what Pablo is now talking about, like trying to reduce the demands of the feminist movement, not just saying that those demands should be women's demands, but not just women's demands, but all women demands. So not all women are pro-abortion, so we should not talk about abortion at all. Not all women are
This is even worse than American liberal feminism.
Yeah, it's worse because
Wow.
we are so conservative and so Catholic and religious and so on. So so mainly what they are saying is that we can only talk about one thing, and it's violence. And it's not violence in a wider sense. It's violence like one.
Like one person murdering another person. Like a man murdering a woman.
Yeah. And that's femicide. And that's what we're allowed to talk about, because even other forms of violence that are more subtle, but that are present every day in our lives, are subject for debate and are not taken as a systemic issue.
But even the most right-wing political parties in Chile are not on record supporting the literal murder of individual women by individual men.
No, but they are saying that those men are sick.
Yeah.
They're like weird men that for some unexplainable reason did that horrible thing, but should be like or killed by the state or imprisoned, and that's the end of the issue. We should like demand that and be calm with it.
Because, they're deviations from good masculinity, which is, for their perspective, the normative masculinity, and thus the state, the masculine state, needs to reassert itself vis-a-vis these transgressive bad men who harm women by killing those bad men, rather than seeing these kind of bad men as actually perhaps exemplary of certain dominant forms of masculinity.
And not only masculinity, but expressive of relations that are constitutive of the way in which the working class is organized. There's no, of course, working class as a notion or a concept that is hegemonic here in Chile. We cannot talk about working class in public. It's like really condemned. But we do take that into analysis. So that violence is part of the way in which the relations between people of the working class, in which that relations take form. So it's a tendency even within the feminist movement. So it's not just because the feminist movement is not. We should not like consider it as this like avant-garde movement by itself that demands or the effort of broadening the program and taking into account many aspects of life and so on. It's the result of a work, of a process that we have been developing, and that we have been developing against many tendencies that live within that movement and that are part of the subjectivity that movement allows to grow.
Maybe we should step back for a minute and just lay out what those different currents are within the movement, what their bases of power are, what their level of power is.
I don't think they are like that formal currents. I believe those are tendencies of the way in which the subjectivity of the feminist movement is expressed. So that is the proclivity towards accepting some explanations of violence instead of others. It's a proclivity towards articulating movements, towards going to the streets for some kind of demands and not for other kind of demands. So it's really like something that you can read within the lines, but it's not something that it's already there. So you can say there's this liberal feminist current and it has these bases, and these are the people that are supportive of that current, because that's not the way it works. I believe it's more like a process of development, that it's contradictory and that reveals several layers of politicization within the feminist movement.
So what are the layers? Trying to get you to name names.
I believe the most superficial one is this layer of what I would call like an H&M feminism, like the feminism that it's produced by the circulation of feminist merchandise. People that have come to know feminism because of the way it's printed in media, because they can buy some feminist books or search feminism in the internet.
Books,
or,
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
That might be the better. That might be the better end of the H&M
Yeah.
H&M feminism.
Yeah.
Retail feminism.
Retail feminism. That's the most superficial layer, I believe. Then there's another layer that it's that I'm just inventing these layers. They're not like there, but that's how I picture them.
No, this is scientific socialism, and we are identifying
Scientific feminism.
and we're identifying literal strata that exists within Chilean society.
You can dig up the layers.
Yeah, you can carbon dating or whatever to figure out precisely how large these layers are. You're not inventing anything.
In this invention, this like second layer would be something like the feminism that appears in the universities. That is this kind of feminism that is the result of a way of socialization of the problems of women and violence and abuse and harassment and so on. And because of the way in which universities are organized within themselves, and because of the social composition of the students' movement, that is really homogeneous in terms of...
More middle and upper middle class.
Yes. Because of that, it's really like a sort of feminist politicization that tends to revolve around those issues in isolation of the other issues that are today the main concerns of the working women.
And so is this the layer that is more sex or gender essentialist and separatist and seems like a Andrea Dworkin inspired throwback for listeners in the U.S. to sort of lesbian separatist politics of a few decades ago?
Yeah. They are like focused on a notion of womanhood that is really determinist by biology. And a notion of biology also as something that it's like a true fact that you can. Women are oppressed because they have vaginas, and that's the main reason why we live like this. And the main enemy is patriarchy, and patriarchy is the system of oppression. So it's like really tautological.
And it's like, and patriarchy is the empowerment of people with penises.
Yes, and people with penises rape people with vaginas, so we should like separate them, and that can help develop an autonomous action of the people with vaginas that are women. That's the second layer, I would say, of politicization, and I would say it's the second and really close to that retail feminism or H&M feminism, because it's really easy for that ideology to develop in those places. And because with a little bit of discussion and debate around what the feminist movement in Chile had been in its history and its process, those certainties tend to erode and fall down. So, well, there's several other layers. I would say the third one is the result of this merger between the education movement and this feminist movement and all the other social movements, and that's the creation of a feminist social movement. And that's the transformation of the issues that concern organizations on a local level, on workers level, on unions, on the places of work and study and so on. I believe that that's the layer in which we, as the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, and we as though that part of the feminist movement are trying to develop something that making the relations between the power of the feminist movement with the power of the social movement to grow with one another.
One thing to add is that I think that the student movement, the way the feminist wave of 2018 emerged in colleges and universities is like what you were saying is similar to the student movement of 2011 in the sense that it saw itself as in a way as disconnected from the rest of the struggles. I have a difference with what you were saying, that I don't think that like in Chile, most of the students right now are not middle or high class, are basically the sons and daughters of the working class that have been able to access higher education through debt, basically. And that's going to be the next crisis in Chile, probably. The next debt crisis is not, it's going to be between the housing debt crisis and the education debt crisis.
Well, and just as a quick aside, that Chile is indebted, so to the extent that it's celebrated as this middle class miracle, the middle class, to the extent it exists, is very much standing on a mountain of highly unstable debt. I mean, when you use a credit card here, and credit cards are ubiquitous here in a way that I've rarely seen outside of the U.S. or Europe. People accept them at any store, and you can choose to pay your credit card bill on any given purchase with quotas, meaning with interest.
Yes.
Right.
Like,
several installments with
in several
interest.
installments
Yeah.
with interest,
Yeah.
which I've never heard of anywhere. So anyways,
Yeah,
quick-
people.
no.
Yeah, people who coming from the States or Europe and like in local shops, they offer that alternative, and they're like, "What? Like, what are quotas? What?"
So just for listeners outside Chile, this is really like a deeply debt-fueled situation here. But continue.
And so you have a strong, and that's exactly why the student movement in 2011 emerged with that strength. It's because it's those sectors of the working class who have been able to have access to education and even in housing and having a car, maybe even two cars. But that's all built on debt. And that means that it's super weak. And that means that when the crisis comes, like in 2008, people start to suffer the consequences of that. It's basically a movement of people of indebted students and see themselves as not being part of the working class, right? In the sense that not just that they don't use the word, right? Like we're workers or part of the working class. It's that they don't see that they are part of the same group with people who are strictly dependent on wage, or a social group or a community that is dependent on wage to live and to reproduce themselves. So I think that's one of the reasons why those students 8 years ago and those...
And 8 years ago, this is university students. And
also,
prior to
also
that...
high school.
Okay.
Yeah,
High school.
5 years before that, it was...
The Penguinos.
The high school students who occupied almost all the schools in the country were occupied by the high school students. That's an interesting story too, for the next show. But I think the same reason why the young women who mobilized last year in the universities around violence saw themselves disconnected from the broader issues of the feminist movement, but also of the working class in general. It's the same reason. I mean, it's the same cause for those two phenomena, right? The students in 2011 trying to connect with the workers, but as two different things. Like, we're the students, we have particular interests, and there are the workers who are organized around unions who have not other interests. The same here with the young female students in universities organizing around feminism, against violence, against femicide, against a sexist education, and we're disconnected. And I'm trying to make that connection because I feel that it's like a theme of the working class in Chile. Like, it's still so fragmented. It's so separated.
That's why in some universities, the feminist movement that developed within the universities saw themselves as intersectional, because the students made connections and relations with the workers of the university. So because of that relation, they were intersectional, because they were something and the workers were something else, and they were different from different class, and so class, it's a vector, so we're intersectional.
This is amazing, because I was in the United States 5 years ago in 2014, and at that time there was a concept in Chile that was developed after 2011, after those same huge mobilizations, and that was multi-sectoriality. We understood the popular movement in Chile as divided in sectors: the workers, the students, and community pobladores, people who struggle for housing. And so we saw the need for uniting those sectors. And so we needed this framework that we called multisectorialidad, the idea that we need to connect the different sectors. And so our political perspectives should be multisectorial. And when I went to the US, people would ask me, is that intersectionality? And this is it's great that now it's like coming back from the other side, right? Now, what we used to call multisectorialidad 8 years ago is now intersectionality in the university. And I think that it speaks to the way European and American feminism has had an impact in the way feminism has developed in Chile. In I guess mostly in great ways, like queer theory coming into universities, and not just universities, also high schools, and basically changing the face of sexuality among the youth in Chile. It's like it completely changed. When I was in school,
Maybe more so than even the U.S., Judith Butler is both a rock star here to the people who love her in a way that just on a scale that's just not true, on a scale that's just not true in the U.S., and is like a demon. She was her visit this year was protested by the right, which believes that something called gender ideology is this like left-wing conspiracy theory to destroy the
cultural
family.
Marxism.
Cultural Marxism, I think, is what American right-wingers would call it more.
Yeah.
But here it's
it's like the war on
gender
Christmas.
ideology.
It's both.
Yeah, both. But yeah, so that's had a huge impact here. But also you're saying it's had some bad effects too, not just the...
I mean, in the way that any sort of adaptation, like uncritical adaptation and adoption of concepts is, like in any movement. Like there's no way you can bring something that was created for a whole, like completely different context, that it makes sense here. It's like trying to understand the racial dynamics in Chile using American categories, or the experience of slavery in the Reconstruction and then the civil rights movement. Like there's no way you can understand the racial dynamics between like a sort of like mixed Chilean republic against like the colonial state based on that mixed republic against the indigenous people. That's completely different from like slavery and civil war and all of that.
And our American categories also obscure American reality, so they can only be more obscurantist here. I mean, like we were discussing the other day, the concept of people of color, which might have some utility, certainly also sort of like flattens the distinction between, say, an affluent person of South Asian descent, high caste South Asian descent, whose father is a doctor in New Jersey, and a descendant of American slaves who is growing up on the south side of Chicago. People of color just sort of makes this into one like smooth category. And so that's already a problem in the US. And then to export that to Chile, which has an entirely different history.
So yeah, like using the term white feminism to refer to women in Chile who maybe are not indigenous, for instance, who are not of African descent, which you have people here in the whole Latin America who are African Latin American, right? But using the term white feminism, you can use it critically, right? You can use the idea of white feminism to try, maybe, okay, let's understand the racial dynamics and gendered racial dynamics in Chile. And that's a thing, right? And then like creating your own, not just the words, but the way to think about it. But then white feminism is, or other like variations of that same, like white whatever, as an insult or as a way to simply like close the debate. There's no debate after that. Like, what are you going to say? Like,
It's like U.S. liberal identity politics translated, which are already a problem in the U.S., translated into Chile, where they make no sense at all.
I believe we're sort of living in a in the second part of a movie that was filmed in the US in the 70s.
yes.
Yeah, and it's a really like hideous movie.
Sequel.
Yeah, a sequel. Yeah, that's right. And we have the radical feminism, and we have identity politics, and we have all those debates, and they are almost the same, like mirrored and distorted by the way in which, of course, we have lived and thought about our oppression and our struggles in the last decades. But it's almost the same. It's like a joke.
To loop back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, what specifically has been the role of the consciously anti-capitalist left in both of these struggles, the No More AFP and the feminist movement?
In the feminist movement, what we have been trying to do is to overcome the separation of capitalism and gender oppression, and trying to locate the need for gender oppression within capitalism, and then come up with some sort of unitarist form of struggle to overcome the ways in which capitalism in Chile shapes our oppression and the way in which we live. So that's basically what we have been trying to do. And that's the result of a process of discussion and understanding capitalism here, and also of trying to connect the consciousness of the feminist movement, or something like that, that came up with this notion of patriarchy, to connect the content of that notion that have been critical to the development of the feminist movement, and take that content and put it in the context of a general system that organizes life and the reproduction of life daily and in a generational level. That's the work that we have been trying to do.
So it's fair to say that the Chilean feminist left is fairly in tune with the sort of feminism articulated in Feminism for the 99% from Nancy Fraser, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Cinzia Ruzza.
Yeah, I would say that, because a large amount of feminists here, we had been reading that sort of literature. We have been discussing that sort of literature. Maybe not the manifesto, but because
it's very recent.
Yeah, it's too recent. But Cinzia Ruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, but also Silvia Federici. She's huge here. When she was here last year, thousands of women came to visit and listen to her and ask her questions, as she was kind of like this genius of feminism. We have been trying to take that, because it's something that helps to develop a consciousness of the relation that maybe can overcome the external relation between gender oppression and capitalism. But we have also tried to do that in a practical way, not just by reading and discussing, but also by organizing in some way that reveals that connection and reveals that relation, and also can create the ways of thinking collectively about the transformative power of the movement that we are creating. And it's in the initial steps right now. We're sort of in the process of building that capacity and that ability of thinking collectively in a way that can overcome the tendencies to split apart the different aspects of reality and think of the interconnections. But I believe the practical way in which we are doing so is growing and making that capacity grow also.
Well, a two-part follow-up on that. One, what is the radical left's power within the broader feminist movement? To what degree is it one force among many, and to what degree is it in terms of the actual leadership, the predominant force? And then two, following up on the last thing you said, what does this movement look like beyond these protests, which are impressive? They're it's maybe the largest protest I've ever seen in my life. What does building power and changing society look like for the movement beyond that?
I don't believe that the anti-capitalist left has really power within the movement. I believe that we are scattered through the movement and maybe placed in positions that help us amplify the way in which we're interpreting the work that we have been doing and come up with ways of processing this movement and the way it articulates itself within itself. Why do I say we have not like power? It's because we have no structure. The movement, it's not really structured on a national level. We have these sorts of coordinations, but we are like in the initial steps. So I believe that the process of building power, it's starting, and we are in the right places right now because we are working in this so much. We like the radical left, the anti-capitalist left, that's our left, has put all its energy in building that capacity and in building the conditions for that movement to continue the process and not fade out after these really high points of mass demonstrations in the street, but to consolidate that capacity of making relations within several sectors or aspects of the social movement.
What might that look like for No More AFP? It's extremely ambitious what they're doing, but there's a proposal to transform the Chilean pension system, and winning would look like, one part of winning would look like getting that passed by the legislature. Yeah. What does building power and short and medium term victories look like for the feminist movement?
I believe there's no image of the way in which we can win, but not because we're not like trying to build that image. What we have been saying is that we want feminism to become the shape of an alternative against the radical right and extreme really far right in the continent. What I would say is that this winning would look like international coordination and the possibility of proposing ourselves some milestones in the path for at least Latin America. Of course, I would say like one way of winning would be having abortion, free abortion, legal abortion in Latin America as a whole. That would look like a success. But also to have some sort of women's and sexual dissidence coordination in an international level that helps us to come up with a program of social transformation that we can push forward in a global level.
It seems like maybe, and either of you can respond to this, maybe one reason there's less of a concrete policy goal when it comes to the feminist movement is in part what you're trying to do is make feminism a transversal force throughout all of these social movements, including No More AFP social movements across the board in Chile. And so the goals are sort of also what those movements' goals are.
Right, and that's in the program for the strike, right? That includes all of the different social movements, demands and claims for change. In our case, in the pensions movement, it's different. I mean, we have a more specific, as you say, a policy goal. We want to change the pension system. We want actually to have a pension system. Because as I was saying before, there's no pension system. In Chile, it's basically a private insurance industry. So in that sense, it's different. it's different. Anyway, we have a huge problem with that, is that the way the pensions are organized in Chile as this private insurance industry, it means that with that money coming from wages, basically large sectors of the national production are funded by that. And so it's not that easy. It's not simply a policy goal. I mean, it takes the shape of a policy, but it's more deep and complex than that.
Yeah, reading an interview that you did the other day, something that really stuck out to me is the way that this, I won't say like it's a modest policy goal, because creating an actual pension system that pays people what they need to live is not modest at all. It's quite radical. But it's what's even more radical than that is that this is tied to a demand for popular control over the investment of the social security system's surplus into the Chilean economy. In other words, a form of democratic control over the social surplus, which is really quite radical.
Yes, that's one of the things that the radical anti-capitalist left was trying to push within the movement, was let's focus on that discussion. Let's talk about who's going to decide what to do with those funds. And so management and investment of pension funds, we think that that's a discussion that can push for an anti-capitalist perspective for the movement. Because in itself, social security is basically, it's like not even social democratic policy. It's basically like good capitalism, right? Like in the post-war boom, you have social security across the board in the industrialized Western countries.
It's Fordism.
Exactly. And so it's more weak. It's weaker in the early 20th century, but then in the 1950s, you have social security everywhere. Even in Chile, some forms of social security. But then in this context, like with a crisis that it's not stopping, there's a huge fight like around those funds, right? The pension funds are everywhere, are being disputed by basically between the working class and the ruling classes everywhere. Like you see in Brazil, they are trying to create a private pension system, like modeled on the Chilean system. And there's going to be a lot of resistance. The same in Argentina. So everywhere pensions, which are basically the way the workers can reproduce themselves as a class, right? It's under attack.
And obviously that's been a long-term goal of the right in the United States, where, Bush tried to privatize Social Security. All of these sort of deficit hawk budget balancing type proposals of the last decade or more were all about, Social Security is unsustainable. We have to reform benefits and raise the retirement age. This is a constant trope.
Right. And so we, as part of the anti-capitalist left, we thought, okay, so this is a demand, the change of a pension system is a demand that it's transversal. Anyone who is working or dependent of someone who works needs a change in the pension. There's a crisis there. So we need to work for that, for an actual change in the pension system. And that's, as I was saying, it's not even a social democratic reform. So we understood, we saw that. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to fight for that change. But then we saw that, as in any other issue, we need to try to push an anti-capitalist agenda within that struggle, and not using that struggle as a stepping stone for actual revolution, which is something that some parts of the left do.
Not in like a sneaky sectarian weirdo way.
Exactly.
That is reasonably going to freak everyone out.
Let's go to the movement and like recruit the best elements of the movement. Right now, it's not that, and it's not just like, okay, let's give like some and resources to this movement and then like exchange it from votes in the next election, which is something that other sectors of the left also do, or political movements in general. We're thinking, let's like through this struggle, let's push more anti-capitalist perspectives. And that was basically two things. One was, I was saying, let's talk about the administration, the management, and where do we invest these funds, right? Because with the surplus of the pension, like after you get all the money, collect all the money from the workers, then you pay the pensions, and then you have a lot of money left, and that's like millions of dollars. So what do we do with that? Currently, This is funneled into the financial system internationally. And so basically the same money you get from loans to pay like your house or your education is the same money you already gave to the pension system through the AFPs, right? To the private pension funds. It's a perfect circle for business. And then they use this money and then they get like all the interest in the financial system, but also investment like in actual production, not just like speculative money. And so that's one thing. Let's talk about who is going to decide on what to do with that, with the pension funds. And so we were talking about like maybe we can have like enlarged social spending. Maybe we can have, I don't know, like building and like different kinds of financial institutions that are controlled by retired workers. And that's one thing. And then the other was trying to open and change and transform the concept of who is a worker, basically. And then in a way that the pensions are not just like deferred wage that you get after you retired, but the pensions are basically like the value of the working class in general. And so
because there's something very privatized about the way people, at least in the US, think about Social Security.
It's my retirement.
I paid into this, in contrast to something like quote unquote welfare, which is someone who's not working, mooching off of something funded via the taxes of someone who is working, unlike Social Security, which is different because it's mine. I paid into it.
Yes. So we were trying to change that. So that means breaking individualism as the common sense of pensions and other stuff. But then also we were trying to change the idea of work is only waged work. And so we said we need to focus and open the movement basically to migrant workers and women, as especially in reproductive labor and domestic work and unwaged work in general. I would say we have not been completely successful in doing that, but through a large process of debating this, our proposal for a new pension system, we were able to introduce some changes in connection with the feminist movement, at least in this new pension system that we are proposing, recognizing domestic work and unwaged work as actual work. So when someone who has been working all her life in that kind of work, she gets a pension that it's not just the universal pension that everyone gets like in welfare systems, but actual recognition of that work. So you spend 30 years like caring for someone or raising kids or working in your community, like in some sort of like care community system, whatever, like you get that work recognized and you should get pension for that. And so, I mean, that's our proposal. It's not, we're far from that being the system. And it's going to take not just like good policy, it's going to take like class struggle.
Because that's like literally wages for housework almost, which is a stepping stone to, which is a big advance, but short of decommodifying all of these sorts of labor relationships and just giving everyone the pension. I want to step back to before we finish and talk a little bit more about Chilean politics generally speaking, for people who aren't familiar with them. First, where does Chile fit into this broader story of the rise and fall of the Latin American pink tide? Because the regional story, as it's generally understood, is that these new left or leftish, depending on one's perspective, governments arose during the 2000s, in recent years have fallen from power because the commodity boom that was fueling their increased social expenditure that did a lot of good in many countries, that commodity boom went bust, and then the left fell. And so a new right, an extreme right, in the case of Brazil, is now leading a hemispheric reaction. But Chile is often described differently. It's described as a country that is sort of ping-ponged back and forth between center-left and center-right governments since the return of democracy. Where do you see the Chilean story fitting into the regional story, and where do you see it departing?
So definitely, I would say there's something related to the fact that the neoliberal response to the crisis in the 70s in Chile happened very early. I think that's one of the reasons that why Chile stands out from the region in terms of the way the commodity boom in the 2000s like was processed in a different way. As you were saying, like in several countries, what happened was that basically that was more like money to spend on social stuff, basically. And despite all the structural or institutional changes in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, most of all, despite all of that, it was basically like enlarging social spending and like creating social programs. So calling it socialism, I guess right now, especially right now, it's out of the table. There's no way that you can call that socialism or even like a socialist revolution. Maybe it was a revolutionary in the sense that it's a very intense way to process that commodity boom, considering the political tensions and even ideological tensions in those countries. Like, for instance, Evo Morales being an indigenous president, right? That's huge, especially in a country with over half of the population being indigenous.
What it precisely was an attempt to address certain social problems without socialism, relying on commodity revenue instead of increasing taxation. I mean, to solve certain social problems, indeed, without advancing even basic social democratic reforms like commodity revenue instead of taxes. Rich people kept most of their money during this period.
Right, and so Chile was prepared for that. Like, we had the vaccine maybe 15 or 20 years before that. Like in the late 70s, early 80s, the Chilean economy was transformed and the constitution and all was transformed to avoid any sort of like populist deviation in terms of like the political administration of those economic underlying processes. Even though we can't understand Chile like we can't understand any country in Latin America without looking at the way they take part in the global market. And in that sense, Chile and the rest of the countries of Latin America are very similar. Chile is basically a country that exports bits of like stuff, like stone rocks. A friend used to say, like, we basically export like dessert and rocks. That's basically it, right? So copper and other stuff from the mines, and then like whatever you take from the forest and like paper and stuff like that, cellulose and that, and then like fruit. And so the entire country is based around those economic dynamics. Even like you can understand the working class in those terms, like how it's all dependent on those industries. And then you have a huge industry sector, service sector, that a lot of part of that is based around those, like working on the rest of the chain to export those services. And then you have commerce and all that. But so I think that, so the thing that I wanted to say is that Chile stands out because of that supposed like miracle of the 80s. And also, and this is, I guess, similar to the US in terms of the political coalitions, and that we also have a bipartisan system. It's starting to collapse in a way with the extreme right and sectors of the left like going and like growing outside the main parties. But that we also have a system that it was very stable during the 90s and 2000s because of that, the way the constitution and the way the political system was transformed during the dictatorship.
I agree. That last part was what I was going to like underscore. Because of the political representation of the working class in Chile, I believe, had been for many years, decades, those two like main coalitions, and they have taken up the task of ensuring ways of the normal reproduction of the working class by means of focalization of policies of focalization of resources, and that has been quite successful, I believe. Successful in one way, that is destroying systematically the conditions for another form or another way for the working class to find a political representation. So even this new phenomenon that is the Frente Amplio,
Broad front.
yeah, I believe will take part in that way of ensuring the reproduction of the working class, because it's the way in which the whole system is organized. And it's really difficult to produce some sort of political representation that goes another way. That's why I believe we have to create a large process of building a political force a social political force that can push something different and that can create the conditions for another kind of political representation. But if we don't have that capacity, that power, the main thing that's going to happen is another change in the administration, but mainly the same way of government.
Let's just talk about that a little more specifically in terms of electoral politics on the left, or at least to the left of the center. There has been the major center-left coalition, Concertación, which more or less then became Nueva Mayoría, Concertation and New Majority, which has in recent years included the Communist Party, which had previously been on its own. And then there's also this new coalition, which you just mentioned, the Frente Amplio, or Broad Front, which I've heard characterized in a lot of different ways. As you know, I had Daniel Jadue, the mayor of Recoleta, who's a communist, on recently, and he characterized them as a mixed bag that included some left currents and some right liberal currents. So what's your take on both of these coalitions, their significance for Chile and the Chilean left in particular?
I would agree with Jadue in that picture, because because of course that's not really an interpretation, it's the truth. There are right-wing parties like the Partido Liberal, the Liberal Party, and there are some real far-left parties like, I don't know, Nueva Democracia, New Democracy, that comes from a long line of communist left organizations. So, yeah, that's true. What we believe, what we have discussed so far, is that at least the Frente Amplio, Broad Front, that's a funny translation. It's the way in which a process of politicization within some layer of the working class, that it's really, you can like trace a line and say this is the layer that it's been represented by the Broad Front, the Frente Amplio.
Particularly the student movement?
Yeah, the student movement. Yeah, I would say that. And that process of politicization came up with this sort of attempt to participate in the way in which the political system is organized. And in the very beginning of this coalition, it was an electoral effort. And that's in its DNA. It's part of the form of unity that it produces and tends to reproduce. So I believe we do not know what the Frente Amplio is, because it haven't had the chance to develop its project. But I would tend to think that it's one of the tendencies that it may develop is really no more than a change of personnel within the state. And that the labor that has been done by the New Majority and the Nueva Mayoría will be generationally replaced by some of the layers of the Frente Amplio, if it goes in the way that it has been going so far.
Which Jadue also sort of said. He said that the Frente are the children of the New Majority.
Yeah, of course.
The most pessimistic take, but
yeah, that's the pessimistic take, because of course it can be something else. It can be pushed towards a process of densification, social densification. Like, I believe it will be forced to be something else than that like empty promise of ruling this country in a fresh, citizen-like friendly way. that tendency is really strong because the Frente Amplio is now led by Revolución Democrática. That's the main party. It has most of the representatives in the Congress, and it's a party that has no social transformation project. It's mainly humane capitalism, so it's not really promising. There's another part of the Frente Amplio, of course, that is this left that is trying to unite and come up with something else. And that has this political thesis of this rupture or break, democratic break, that should be performed by these masses that would be trying to enter the state and break the closures of the dictatorship and the way that dictatorship...
To finally end the transition.
Yeah. I don't know what could come up if that's the case.
I was going to say that there's a reason for the emergence of Frente Amplio, and that's it's that the transition has not ended. Basically, people say a lot of things about themselves, and you can't just believe them, right? And so Frente Amplio, in a way, has a more progressive and in some sense is like a socialist perspective. But actually, when you see what's going on with their politics, what do they actually do? You see that it's a program for actually like fulfilling the promises of ending the dictatorship in Chile, which is a lot. I mean, it's not something that you can just dismiss. But it's the same as like the popular unity. Was it a revolution? Was it like a social revolution? Was it a national popular movement for actual capitalism to develop in Chile in a way that it's not like peripheral capitalism dependent and colonial or neo-colonial capitalism, right? And so I guess it's like the same, right? I mean, we know that history happens first as a tragedy and then as a farce, and not in the sense that it's like fake, but in the sense that it's epic. It's not so epic, right? It's basically like fulfilling those promises, which are basically redistributing resources for more people and like not having the most unequal country in Latin America, having a political system that is more open to diversity, not having the armed forces and the military and the police being so corrupt and overbearing on politics, having an actual separation of the state and the church. So basically it's like
a new constitution.
Yeah. It's like, so it's basically like becoming Chile like a modern country, a developed country. In that way, it's not so different from the Concertación and then Nueva Mayoría, the new majority. The difference is who's doing it. And that's very important because as Alondra was saying, Frente Amplio represents a new wave of politicization in Chile, especially for the youth and some sectors of the workers that don't feel represented by the former blocs in power, the Concertación and the new majority. And that means that they are looking for a place where to organize their political concerns. And I think, and some of them come from resisting the dictatorship in the 80s or the 90s. Some of them come from the student movement 10 years ago. And some of them are like rehashed old politicians that are bored with their parties and then they move to Frente Amplio to have like a fresh space. And so in that way, I think we need to see Frente Amplio as a progressive tendency among like the population, among the political process in Chile. That doesn't mean that it's gonna end the way they think it's gonna end. I agree with Alondra that Frente Amplio government can become basically a management of the current moment of capitalism in Chile in a way that it's different from the more extreme ways. So maybe it's not racist. Maybe it's not the most patriarchal sectors of the right wing or the center left or center right parties. But it's definitely not an anti-capitalist revolutionary movement, despite what some sectors in the movement can say. So it has that double meaning right now, political meaning. It's a progressive in a way, but it has the potential of being regressive at a moment of a major crisis. So we could see a Frente Amplio government stopping and like putting the brakes on a social movement that is pushing, like, for instance, the feminist movement that is trying to unite large sectors of the working class across the wage-unwaged divide. And they're going to say, no, we can't like fund pensions for everyone. Like there's a limit to that.
What about Concertación, New Majority? Obviously, people from the Frente and the independent left have plenty of criticisms of them. I've also heard that from some people that Bachelet, for all of her shortcomings, did achieve some concrete accomplishments. And then within that, there's the controversial question of the communists' entry into Bachelet's government. What's your assessment of that?
I would picture it with an example that I believe it's really speaks a lot of the way in which the New Majority and Concertación works politically. That is what Bachelet did with abortion. The feminist movement have been pushing forward the demand for free and legal abortion in Chile, and she took that and presented a project that was for abortion in three causales.
Causes.
In three cases, in three circumstances, maybe?
Abortion in three circumstances would be allowed. And those circumstances were rape, endangerment of the woman's life, and fetus not being able to live outside the uterus. So what she did with that was to paint a picture of a progressive sort of measure, but it was really a stoppage of a process of development of a social demand towards sexual and reproductive rights for women. I believe that measure that she put forward, that project, it speaks about the way in which New Majority takes some of the demands of the social movement and then tones it down and makes them a new way of governing the same exclusionary and precarizing sort of system and form of organizing life here. That also in the students' movement demands, one of them was free education for all. And what she did was she took that and she made free education imply more scholarships for some. And so this universalistic demand that the student movement could come up with after a decade or so of organizing and discussing and putting forward a project of public education was transformed into its most neoliberal form possible. That is what the Nueva Mayoría does. That's the way its politics works. So of course it's better than like Bolsonaro, it's better than Macri, it's better than Piñera, because the social movement demands are part of the government concerns and issues. But in terms that deactivate the social movement's power, because after that, after Bachelet took, for example, the demand for free education, the student movement declined, absolutely. And every horizon of social change in education was lost. So it's really dangerous for the social movement, maybe even more dangerous for its process of political development than the right. Of course, the right is more dangerous for the conditions of life, day-to-day life, because it's repressive, hyper-repressive, and violent, and so on. But in terms of political development, the New Majority acts like this political decompressor. So, and this machine of processing the demands of the social movements in neoliberal terms.
Yeah, it's basically a politics of neutralization of social movements and social demands for change. And I think that has to do with who they represent. Basically, Concertación was founded in the late 80s when the struggle against the dictatorship was becoming a problem for the regime. And there had to be political solutions, right? Because in early 80s...
It was Concertación por la Democracia.
Exacto. Concertación por la Democracia. Concertation for democracy. And that included the newly created parties that were old leftist, became progressives, in some cases like openly, I wouldn't say neoliberal, because in those days people wouldn't talk like that so much, but like open to like free market, social free market in a way. So it's like, let's have capitalism, but let's make some adjustments. And the Socialist Party was there. The Socialist Party had like undergone a process of we call it like renovation, and that basically meant transforming the ideas of socialism into social programs for the extreme poor.
Because the Socialist Party was the party of Allende in the broader coalition, but the Socialist that was his party,
and it
became a very different party.
And it always had different like fractions. There were some very radical ones. Even during the Allende government, there were some groups within the Socialist Party calling for an armed revolution. Allende was not from that section. Allende was closer to the Communist Party in the Popular Unity. We would say more conservative reading of the political process. So Concertación was born out of a need to organize the political struggle against the dictatorship because the social struggle was already happening since the early 80s. We had a huge financial crisis in the early 80s, 82, 83. Thousands of people going to the streets, especially women in the neighborhoods, in the popular neighborhoods, organizing their communal life in a way that allowed them to resist the crisis. And so there was already a social movement against the dictatorship, organized from below in a way. But then political parties were prohibited at the time, and then there was an opening for new political parties, and then the Concertación happened. There was always the problem of Christian Democrats, which we know is a party created in the 50s, in the 60s, to basically give a space, a conservative space for social transformation, right? So it's basically the same as Alondra was saying, this neutralizing politics of taking radical demands and turning them into demands that are processable.
It's the right of the center left in Chile, whereas in Europe, I think it's often the left of the center right.
Yeah, it's more conservative. Yeah, everywhere.
But here, the Christian Democrats both played a key role in the coup and in ending the dictatorship.
Exactly. They have that role in Chile, the political role of being like in between the center, like being the actual center in political terms. Because in social, like in their actual platform, they're basically right wing, but they have that role in the political spectrum. So the promise of the Concertación was basically to end the dictatorship and then make the transition to a new system, basically based on like civil liberties and open market, that combination of democracy and capitalism, but the nice capitalism, right? And the thing is that didn't happen. Right, the promise of Concertación, their slogan was the joy, happiness is coming. La alegría ya viene. Joy is coming. That's the slogan for the Concertación for the referendum in '88.
This is that commercial where they're all building a house together in the middle of like the field.
Yeah, So around the referendum, there's a very interesting campaign in like advertisement, political advertisement. And so they wanted to show this happy Chile coming and the dictatorship on the other side, which is weird. Like you have like an election between the dictator and saying no to the dictator. That's basically the referendum. It was the yes to Pinochet, the no to Pinochet. And it's weird because generally people vote for the yes, right? Like voting no, it's like
negative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But people were fed up with the dictatorship and then they voted no. And so this Concertación, they feel so proud of defeating the dictatorship with the paper and the pencil. This is what they say. This is the Christian Democrat narrative of the transition, is that there was no armed struggle involved, which is simply not true. It's just that they, the Christian Democrats, just killed everyone who was involved in armed struggle during the early 90s. Because they, in this new government, democratic government, they created what was known as the office, which is fun. It's a funny name after the TV show, but it was not that funny in the early 90s, where you had former socialists and Christian Democrats and people from the center left basically chasing militants from the armed struggle groups that was still existing at that point to detain them or kill them. And so they were organizing assassinations to basically deactivate that strand of struggle in Chile. Okay, so now, in a way, Frente Amplio is representing the more radical moment of that promise. It's not the conservative, right? They're not the ones who are gonna like chase radical militants. I mean, you never know. People in government like do weird stuff, I guess. So leftists becoming presidents. We were talking about this the other day. I mean, you get to government, you need to have like a
if
general.
Bernie Sanders elected president, who's he going to choose as the FBI director?
Right.
It's going to be someone.
Who's going to be in the Pentagon of the Jacobin bunch, right? Who in DSA is going to like work for that? I mean,
it's a serious dilemma.
Yeah, you have to like make those questions. But that's another thing. The thing is that's the promise, and they're trying to like work on that, I think, and that's the risk of that.
And quickly before I let you go, what about the controversy over the role of the Communist Party and their entrance into the new majority? Obviously, that didn't please some of the CP militants, but it's also not known as being the most democratic party in Chile. So, and then on the other hand, you have Daniel Jadue, who I interviewed, obviously, on this podcast, being one of their most popular politicians, doing really innovative, kind of not what you'd conventionally think of as communist things in Recoleta, but having what are seen as pretty serious, if not publicly expressed, differences with the traditional Communist Party leadership.
The Communist Party did not just enter in this new majority, it came up with the idea of the new majority. They also came up with the name of the new majority. It was their project, and they read that it was necessary to enlarge the composition of this political coalition that administered, and to like push forward a leftist perspective within some of the political spaces, of the main political spaces. They had ministers, they like trained themselves to be government. I believe that's why they attempted that. It's part of their strategy. That's the democratic revolution. That's how they named it in their Congress in the 1994. I believe it's a continuation. It's not a rupture or a break in their strategy. It's like the development of that strategy. So it was something that we could like have foreseen. Maybe the people that are not happy with the decision are not really like that close with the strategy content of the Communist Party, because of course they want to be government again. They want to create the basis for a popular government in Chile. So their participation in this coalition and in the administration of the state is part of that training. It's part of the acquisition of the capacities to govern in Chile. And I believe that what they say in public at least, they defend the government of Bachelet. They believe it was quite successful. Of course, they read that there's a process of pushing forward the main social demands and the main aspects of the program, and then this moment of pushback because of the forces relations,
the balance of forces.
Yeah, the balance of forces within the nueva mayoría, the new majority.
Like they blame a lot of the shortcomings on the Christian Democrats in particular.
as always. Yeah, they always blame the Christian Democrats.
Which is not crazy.
Yeah. And the Christian Democrats blame the communists.
Yeah,
So
they
it's,
it's like a really symbiotic relation. So, of course, I, as a leftist person, do not agree with this strategy. I believe it doesn't help the working class to achieve transformations that can increase the ability of the working class of producing an alternative, a world alternative. But I believe it's really coherent with the way in which the Partido Comunista, the Communist Party, interprets the social change in a neoliberal country. Because the way in which they believe neoliberalism organizes society is that it produces a new contradiction. That it's this main contradiction of the political moment, that is the contradiction between democracy, understood as formal democracy, and neoliberalism. And so they interpret themselves in being part of the government as an advance of democracy against neoliberalism.
Which is like a secondary order, second order contradiction within capitalism, but where the primary focus
political struggle
should be at the moment. Just to finish up, what's your take on this? And do you see a possible realignment where all of the various forces of the left, from the communists who have been a new majority, to the left forces within Frente Amplio, to the extra parliamentary left that you all are involved in, do you see some possible realignment where all those forces are brought into coalition with one another in a way that could be powerful?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a level of opposition to the right-wing government right now that there's a space for that. And not just a space, there's a need for that. There's a need for a broad coalition, not coalition, but an opposition, like a social and political opposition to this government, any other government that is following the same policies. That's one thing. And that already happens, not in an organized way, but it happens when within the social movements, we find ourselves hand in hand struggling against the pension system with members of the Communist Party, with members of Frente Amplio. And that's great, because there's unity in that struggle. For us, that's a key thing to actually have an impact politically. But then strategic differences are so deep that I don't see in the near future a space for that sort of coalition. Because I feel that there's a difference in the way, for instance, the way the Communist Party and some sectors of the Frente Amplio understand the role of social movements in a very different way. They have this is my take, they have an old Leninist idea that social movements are like unions, and so they have an economic limit. Yeah. And so politics is only the role of the party. And then the party basically like organizes the political process for those movements to be like...
for their demands to be articulated in the political sphere.
Exactly.
Under the management of the party.
Exactly. And they have to like work for that on the ground. And then, but okay, now it's, you have to leave us, like do the negotiation or the actual like power situation. So that way to understand the relationship between social movements and politics in general means that it's not just wrong, like ethically, that they are just like using and instrumentalizing social movements. That's one thing. The most immediate thing is that they are not understanding the new composition of the working class in Chile. They are not understanding that politics, in the traditional sense of parties going to struggle for a place in the state, is the way the political representation is going to happen in the next century.
And so just to finish up, what would then a productive, progressive relationship between social movements and left political parties in Chile, like what might that hypothetically look like, and how do you get there?
In the immediate future, what I imagine is the possibility of this left-wing government between, of course, the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, Communist Party, and some of the people of the Concertación. because I do not believe that the Frente Amplio can govern. They don't have the people to do that. So what I imagine would be like that happening, and the social movement, with our participation in it, trying to establish some sort of political autonomy for its continuing growth. I believe that in the immediate future would be the best scenario, because we would...
So that would be a political realignment that would take the left portions of the Frente Amplio, combine them with the Communist Party and maybe the left of the Socialist Party and maybe some other forces, and then maintaining social movement autonomy within that and not having it totally be deactivated and co-opted into that government.
Yeah, and that would be a struggle, of course, because the struggle today to keep the autonomy of the movement is something that is difficult, and it's hard to do. And I believe it would be harder to do that with this coalition in the government. But I believe it would be like the best scenario, because we would know for a fact the limits of the participation in the state. The social movement, and so the working class, could learn from that experience and could develop new ways of organizing itself. But I believe it's the main task for this moment.
Último comentario y terminamos.
Yeah, I would say that, as Alondra was saying, that independence of the social movements is the basis for a new politics in Chile, or for a new revolutionary politics in the left, in the sense that changing the idea that the avant-garde of politics, of revolutionary politics, is in the state, and understanding that politics in the state is the rear guard for an actual revolution. They are the one who should be like holding the fort, so that the military is not like doing another coup. And it's the actual social movements and the organized labor and militant mass movements that should be doing the actual struggle against landlords, against corporate interests on the ground internationally. And that definitely looks like an international thing. It's not like we can like see this process happening only nationally. So I guess like the connection to like unblock this weird dilemma of what are we going to do in the next years, it has to do with connecting with and working in a strategic perspective with political movements, anti-capitalist movements in other countries in Latin America.
Alondra Carrillo and Pablo Abufom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks.
Alondra Carrillo is a psychologist, feminist activist, and a member of the Coordinadora Feminista 8M, or the March 8th Feminist Coordinator. Pablo Abufom is a translator, militant in the Solidaridad organization, a founding member of the Social Center and Projection Library, and a member of the Coordinadora Nacional de Trabajadores y Trabajadoras No Más AFP, which roughly but not very elegantly translates as the National Workers Coordinator against the Pension Fund Administrator. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Julia Rock. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What also does that is you telling other people about the show. Please make propaganda for us. And last but by no means least, find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution. to help keep this operation up and running strong.